Curtis, thank you very much. It's terrific to be with all of you tonight. Thanks for coming out on a dark and stormy night. Uh, I think you're in for a treat. We have a number of programs scheduled this year that relate to the presidential election, and there's no better way to start than tonight talking about religion and how it intersects with the 2020 presidential election. We have two really good experts here to join us in our conversation, and I want to introduce both of them to you. Terry Mattingly, to my left here, immediate left, is our newest fellow at the Overby Center. He's a senior fellow, and he has written about religion for more than 3 decades, I guess 4 decades. He's been writing a weekly column since 1988 that's distributed by Scripps Howard News Service. And I have said to one and all, I believe he's the best religion columnist in the country because the subjects he writes about interest me. And if they interest me, I figure it interests most people. And beside him is Richard Ostling. Richard has had a distinguished career in journalism. He was a senior correspondent for Time magazine. He wrote 23 cover stories for Time magazine, and then he was chief religion writer for the Associated Press, covering religion all over the country. And as we were just talking about, he went to 43 different states covering religion for the AP and for Time magazine. This is his first visit to Mississippi. So let's welcome both Terry and Richard. So let's start right out, since we're journalists and go for the lead, about this 2020 election. I'd like to ask both of you separately what you think the number one religion intersection is with the 2020 election.
Boss, why don't you start? He's my editor, so why don't you start?
Well, I know what everybody's going to tell you it is, and Dick and I have different spins on that. Probably the single figure used the most in the last 3 years related to religion and politics is, we can all chant it together, 81% of white evangelicals voted
For Trump. Yeah.
Well, and hidden within that is a whole lot of complexities, a lot of which is a lot of those people, according to Christianity Today, and some others who did some groundwork on that, at least half of those white evangelical voters wanted to vote for someone else. They didn't want to vote for Donald Trump. They were not his supporters at the most crucial time, which was the primaries. And then also a lot of evangelicals stayed home. So one of the things we need to be watching, multiple levels, to wrap this up quickly, we need to watch to see if evangelicals in African American settings and Latino settings are more vocal this time, and we hear more from them. But that would require the Democrats to come out with a ticket that might lean more toward the center, and tempt those people to vote for them. So I would watch Latino evangelicals in particular in the next couple of years, in the next couple of months, I should say. And also watch the sizable number of voters who feel they don't have any choice but to vote for Trump. They don't want to. It's the lesser of two evils story that you probably have heard so much about. So you're going to hear about evangelicals over and over because journalists kind of have that on the brain from the last election. But I would agree with Mr. Ostling that the real issue politically is somewhere else this year. So take it away.
White Catholics. Leave aside Latino Catholics, which is a whole other thing culturally and politically. But really an earthquake has happened in this past generation where non-Latino Catholics have become pretty much a reliable Republican vote. And the more devout they are, the more frequently they attend Mass on Sundays, the more Republican they tend to be. Okay, now why is that important? Well, if you've studied, I'm sure journalists out here, student journalists have studied 2016, right? Florida, Wisconsin, Michigan, and you could add in Iowa and Ohio and so on.
Pennsylvania.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Thank you. Pennsylvania. In other words, places where sentiment of non-Latino Catholics is going to make all the difference. The numbers on this are really astonishing. Go back to 1972, which was poor George McGovern who got clobbered, right, running against Nixon in that year's presidential election. At the time, Catholics were overwhelmingly wedded to the Democratic Party. Now, in terms of poll sentiment, they're not up to 50% Republican, but they're in the 40s, and they are, I'm trying to remember the numbers, but significantly, less than what you had before. So this is really a tremendous change in the whole political makeup of the United States. Another side issue to watch this year, we could have a Jewish president for the first time, Sanders, Bloomberg, and they will be either the most secular presidents in the history of the United States or the most secular along with Donald Trump, whatever you make of Mr. Trump.
Well, there's a lot to unpack in what you just said, Dick, but I wanted to skip over to Terry. Terry spoke to a class that Curtis and I teach. He spoke this afternoon. Terry broke down the Catholic vote into 4 categories, and our students were fascinated by that. So could you elaborate a little bit on that for this audience?
Yeah, anytime you see the phrase, the Catholic vote, in a news report, you can almost chunk the newspaper or your tablet or whatever out the window. There is no one Catholic vote. A very wise old K Street priest in D.C. once put it to me in a way that stuck in my mind. He said, at the very least, we have 4 different Catholic votes. And one of them is the ex-Catholic vote, and the solid Democrat. The second is the cultural Catholic. Okay, they didn't turn my mic on?
Well, Terry said he talked loud enough he didn't need a microphone.
Okay. Let's try it again. Did I bump it or something? Okay. Hello. I feel like I'm wearing a flight helmet up here anyway. Okay. Cultural Catholics. They go to church once or twice a year when their parents or grandparents want them to, and they might get married in a Catholic church, sort of. But the label Catholic still has meaning to them. The third level is the really crucial one, and this priest called this the ordinary Sunday morning Catholic. They go to church on Sunday morning, they show up in the minivan, the kids run to Sunday school, and they're normal Catholics. That's the swing vote. More than any other, that's who's in play in American politics. And then the fourth, the final one, I loved his way of putting it, was the goes to confession and sweats the details Catholic. The people who actually know the doctrine, know the history and heritage of the church, and they have gone overwhelmingly Republican in the last couple of decades, largely in the wake of Roe v. Wade and a host of other changes in our culture. A pollster that I respect greatly, John C. Green of the University of Akron, who's done tremendous work with Pew Forum and Pew Research Center, for those of you who have read their data that's come out many times. John C. Green talking about, I think it was the second Obama election, or maybe the first, but he gave a phrase that just locked it up. He said, this is going to be another election that comes down to Catholics in Ohio who go to church once a week versus Catholics in Ohio who go to Mass once a month. He said the split is going to come which way the people in between those two factors, the marginal Catholic and the active Catholic. That's the swing vote in American politics right now. A swing vote that we can start talking about in the future will be Latino evangelicals.
I agree
I
with
think
that.
that's going to be an interesting, and the word there, to quote a famous Washington journalist who's gone now, Florida, Florida, Florida.
Tim Russert.
Yep,
Yeah.
Russert. Someone who knew a bit about Catholic
Right.
life and politics.
On Green, I just throw in something which is very interesting. Years ago, he just tossed this out in a meeting in Washington that I was covering. And he said, what happened with the Catholics in the Democratic Party? The simple thing, people would say, oh, they passed Roe v. Wade, so the whole legal thing changed, so the Democrats became identified with the abortion issue, so therefore they all go Republican. He said, no. That's not what happened. What happened was, when Roe v. Wade came around, there was opposition to abortion as a moral problem was so strong in the Catholic tradition that once that happened, it freed Catholics to vote Republican if they wanted to vote Republican on other issues that had nothing to do with abortion. It broke that, home and hearth and neighborhood and parish and coming off the Irish boat in the 19th century kind of phenomenon. And so they were up for grabs at that point.
Terry edits a blog, a daily blog called GetReligion, which analyzes how mainstream media covers religion. And Dick writes for that blog. So I want to ask both of you, what is the most misreported or underreported religious aspect in this 2020 election?
I'm still going to be watching coverage of religious liberty. The court cases on religious liberty.
Now, a lot of people may glaze over on religious liberty. Talk about what that really means.
A symbolic question. You might remember this from some of the early stages of the primaries. Will someone ask the Democratic candidates, are you willing to strip the tax status of private Christian religious schools that clash with the government on LGBTQ issues?
And social service agencies.
And social,
I would
and
add,
then
yeah.
social service agencies, large numbers of which are African American in many cases. At what point will we continue to see this collision between the sexual revolution and the First Amendment? And the coalition that once existed that kind of mediated that in a tolerant way during the Clinton-Gore era, which is not an era for the religious right? Clinton-Gore is not the right wing. But the coalition that existed at that time to protect religious liberty has just been collapsed. And so thus you're left in a worst possible world for people who love religious liberty and other parts of the First Amendment. You're left with people who are pledged to take a very secular, in many ways hostile position on religious liberty versus Donald Trump.
So,
what a world.
So this got a little bit of coverage with Beto.
Right.
But maybe you could expand on that and what was not covered in that.
Well, he was asked about that and came out and said, yes, I think we need to go there. The press didn't notice. I mean, he in fact said we might need to consider taking tax exemption away from churches who don't fit with the government's new doctrines on these issues.
And mosques and synagogues.
And mosques and synagogues and whatever. What the press missed was Pete Buttigieg, who has been one of the candidates most comfortable talking about religion and making it part of his view of life. He said, no, not the churches, but we're going to go after the schools and the social service agencies and the adoption agencies and stuff. So the line between actually taking away the tax exemption of certain churches and take it away from schools, it's the same principle. It's just more widely applied. And the principle for y'all to think about is, at what point does the government get to entangle itself in questions about what is correct doctrine and what is not? and old school First Amendment liberals don't like the government telling people what they can believe and what they can't believe.
That's right. Yeah. If you follow up on that, yeah, the government using the power of tax exemption would be favoring one religious view over against another religious view. Okay, over here we have Southern Baptists or conservative on gay-related issues. There are some Southern Baptists in this state, aren't there?
I figured.
Okay, but over here we have Reform Judaism, and we have the Unitarian Universalists, and we have Mayor Pete's Episcopal Church. So should the government favor this moral religious view over this moral and religious view?
And under equal access laws from the Clinton-Gore era, you do have the option of taking away the rights of all nonprofits in a certain situation. For example, on a college campus, let's say we're here at Ole Miss, and we get in a dispute about whether evangelical students can get student activity fees versus liberal groups. Well, you would have the option of taking away all of their funds equally. You're not discriminating on the base of doctrine. But if you give the money, Vanderbilt style, if you give the money to one side of the debate and not the other, you are actively discriminating on the basis of their doctrine and their beliefs. Now, Vandy's a private school, so that's not a perfect example. Private schools can pretty much do what they want.
Yeah, University of Virginia, we had a case like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Iowa, big fight recently in Iowa
Right.
over the same thing.
So, Dick, you mentioned Pete Buttigieg. Would you say he's been the most intentional in talking about his personal faith? And how would you assess, you and Terry, the other Democratic candidates?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, he's a classic liberal mainline Episcopalian, and he's been very open about it. And his church is very important to him. And so, yeah, he, unlike a lot of Democrats, has not been afraid to give vent to his religious views. So it's interesting. However, the New Hampshire vote was fascinating. New Hampshire is one of the most secular states of the 50, very much the opposite of Mississippi, for example. But among the regularly worshiping voters in the Democratic Party in New Hampshire, one candidate clobbered everybody, and that was Amy Klobuchar. It was one of the factors. She got 28% of the regularly worshiping New Hampshire Democratic vote, compared with only 20% overall. So that was one of the key factors that enabled her to do so well and kind of come out of nowhere in New Hampshire. I don't know if she can sustain that in other states because she doesn't have the money that the other candidates do. I guess we'll see. Meanwhile, Sanders did very well with the non-religious vote, which is what you'd expect.
The other thing that happened with Amy Klobuchar that was significant, she got a lot of the late changing votes. She had a higher percentage of that. And about 36 to 48 hours before that, on The View, she very publicly went against the statements of Bernie Sanders and Buttigieg that they felt that pro-life Democrats basically had no role in the party whatsoever, that they really shouldn't be given any ability to be a part of dialogues. There was no need to talk to them anymore. They were no longer relevant as Democrats. And Klobuchar, while making crystal clear her abortion rights bona fides, she said, no, we can't live with that. We need to have more people in the party, not fewer, and we need to dialogue with them. We need to find out what issues we can cooperate on. She mentioned adoption, child care, and a whole bunch of other things. And when she did that, it hit me. She's trying the Obama 1.0 formula. In talking. And by the way, she's a part of the same church as Obama, the very liberal United Church of Christ. So she's another person who feels comfortable kind of in her own skin. Will that work in the age of woke Democratic Twitter? Are you allowed to say anything nice about pro-life Democrats? Of which, depending on the poll and depending on how you define pro-life, somewhere between 20 and 40% of the Democratic Party would be considered pro-life under some definitions, and most of that is African Americans and Latinos.
Yeah, and
And
certainly
Catholics.
late term
And
abortion
Catholics.
for sure.
Yeah, late term for sure.
Yeah.
Center term. Well,
Oh,
I think
and
most of them
public
would,
funding. Public funding.
and public funding is a huge issue. And of course, Joe Biden, someone who always had taken kind of a moderate Catholic approach on that, Biden had to swing way left. And that shocked a lot of Catholic Democrats.
When you say way left, you want to define it as it relates to abortion.
Government funding for abortion, I'm perfectly fine right up to the moment of
Third
delivery. I'm not even sure I could vote for a bill to protect a fetus that's born alive. You know, the Born Alive bill is going to come up in the Senate again here in a couple of weeks. And gender selection abortion is another symbolic issue,
Yeah.
especially with the technology available today. Would you oppose abortion of female fetuses is what it normally ends up coming down to, as is very common in India, for example. And in certain communities here in America, it's obvious that gender selection abortion is being used. Well, we live in an age where that's controversial. And in the age of Twitter, very controversial with certain types of Democrats.
By the way, this is a little off the religion thing, but Klobuchar mopped the floor with Warren among women voters. And it may turn out that she basically ended the Warren candidacy.
Yeah.
We'll see.
We, in the 20th century, in the 21st century, we've not had an openly atheist president. As you talk about secularist, do you think that could change in 2020?
I don't think so. There's quite an aversion in polling. Certain things, would you vote for a so-and-so? The women's issue gets a lot of discussion on this, of course. I think we'd have to say that atheism with a capital A is going to be a negative for a politician. Even if in their private living room discussion with the missus or whatever, they might, actually be atheistic or heavily doubting the existence of God, but they're not going to surface that. So I think, but as I mentioned before, I think we may have a very secularized Jewish president, it's possible, following a very secularized Protestant, if we call Trump a Protestant. And of course, Biden is interesting religiously. We haven't had a Catholic president in 60 years,
That's right.
which is also very interesting.
Which is to say we've only had one Catholic president.
Probably
Right.
so.
Yeah.
Yeah, Biden doesn't look strong right now. But yeah.
To point out something from polling that, once again, I learned this from John Green years ago. He spotted, many of you are familiar with headlines about the religiously unaffiliated, the nuns, this rapidly growing segment of the American population. A guy that does some work for GetReligion showed a chart the other day that has the nuns within the next 10 years hitting about 22, 23, 24% of the American population. Meanwhile, mainline Protestants liberal mainline Protestants who used to be 23, 22% of the American population, a crucial force in public life, he had them within 10 years of now being down to about 4 to 5%. Well, anyway, he was the first person I ever saw that noted that if you have about 20 to 22% of religiously observant Americans, that their faith makes a major difference in their lives. And that's a fairly low number, but it's been consistent. George Gallup told me that he always put the figure at between 18 and 22, the late George Gallup. He said, that group over there isn't going away. What we're watching is the growth of the religiously unaffiliated / atheist / agnostic. And he was the first person I ever heard that said, we are now in an era where that coalition, vaguely unreligious to specifically unreligious to atheist agnostic, that coalition is now the largest constituency group in the modern Democratic Party. The largest identifiable group within the Democratic Party. religiously unaffiliated, atheist, agnostic. Now, what he said that was fascinating, he said, so here you have the least religious Americans are in this party, but so are the most religious Americans are in the same party, which is African American churchgoers. If you're looking at percentage of which they talk about their faith influencing their life, etc., in many ways, African American churchgoers outscore white evangelicals in terms of the percentage of them that are active in their faith. So put both of those groups in the same party, and what you have is what Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg are going to face when they hit the southern primaries. And you suddenly see Bernie Sanders, who has years of near atheist remarks to try to pull back from public record. We're trying to picture them standing in the pulpits of African American churches in South Carolina and Georgia going, trust me. And how well is that going to work? I don't think Buttigieg's numbers among African American voters has topped 4% anywhere.
Yeah.
He's not connecting with them. And you can't sail the ship of the Democratic Party to success without a massive turnout among African American and Latino voters and Catholics and their Catholics.
You know, while we're throwing numbers around, a really important one, I think, Terry mentioned the famous 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. And Catholics, you know, was in the high 50s. But in a way, this is not headline news. You know, evangelicals vote Republican. I mean, that's the long and short of it. And here's the number, 79%, okay? 81% Trump, 79% for Romney, who is a devout member of the biggest rival group in the United States for evangelicals, namely Latter-day Saints or Mormons. He's famously Mormon. But they went for him 79%. So 79-81, you know, it's almost margin of error territory.
It almost is.
Yeah.
So you said that a big percentage of the evangelical vote, white evangelical vote, reluctantly voted for Trump. Is there a candidate on the Democratic side, in your judgment, either one of you, who could pull some of these reluctant voters over to the Democratic side?
That was what Biden was supposed to do. Biden was supposed to bring back the spirit of Obama. And Obama didn't do great with evangelicals, but he got some. And he was great with ethnic evangelicals. And they really turned out for him. So at this point, my short answer to that is no.
So if you take Dick's numbers, you project ahead to November, it's going to be 79%, 81% evangelicals voting for Trump.
And more of them might show up. Remember in the last election, I've seen it between 20 and 40% of white evangelicals didn't vote in the last election.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can't remember the name, but there's a liberal organization that took a poll last year. Now, this, of course, was looking ahead a year to this year's vote. But again, with my white Catholics, they were, I think it was about 58% planning to vote for Trump. And this came from a liberal polling organization. So, you know, the Democrats have it in their power to turn that around, but I don't see it happening in this particular environment that we're in. I think down the road, you know, 4 or 8 years from now, Democrats might catch on.
But the atheist, agnostic, unaffiliated number is going to keep growing.
Right.
Or at least they think it will.
Yeah.
At least based on current trends.
Yeah, here's the problem. Okay, the Democrats have sewed up the non-religious and anti-religious American vote. And they just about counterbalance the conservative Protestant vote for the Republicans, numerically, kind of similar. Here's the problem. How do you organize atheists, you know? I mean, right? I mean, seriously. African-American churches, you know, they are organized politically. Jewish organizations, they are organized. Catholic interest groups, similarly. And evangelicals have come on like gangbusters since 1980. But We have good polling data on this that agnostics and atheists, or people generally not engaged in religion, are generally not engaged, period. They're not involved in the Kiwanis Club or the Volunteer Fire Company or, name whatever group you want. They're just hard to organize because they're kind of, you might say, unorganized as a matter of principle.
You remind me of Will Rogers' comment about not belonging to an organized
Yes.
political party. He's a Democrat.
He's a Democrat. Yeah, right.
The annual summer gathering of Unitarian evangelists is not that big.
Yeah.
To go give a talk to them and hang out with them.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to move to our audience and let you ask questions while you're thinking of, well, I already have one, so let's go right here.
What do you make of the New York Times endorsement of by endorsement of Klobuchar and Warren? And Warren now is tanking, apparently. Do you know what's on the inside of the New York Times, how they developed that decision? And that
Let's repeat the question because it didn't have a microphone for our television audience. Do you know the inside story of the New York Times double endorsement?
I am not that into partisan politics as a rule. I'm very interested in First Amendment issues. I'll tell you, though, what I thought they were doing. I thought they were trying desperately to not have to have the Democratic National Committee stab Bernie in the back again. I think they're terrified that it's going to be a situation where there has to be a way to stop Bernie, and thus all of his supporters stay home or don't get excited. So I think they've been frantically trying to surface an alternative to Bernie.
I think they were saying, gee, it would be nice to have a woman president. We got two of them left, and you could make a decent case for both of them. This is, by the way, no inside knowledge. I'm just, on the street corner observing this. But it was remarkable that they couldn't pick one person.
In the back over here.
Hi, what do you think? Do you have anything to say about the court challenges recently to the parsonage?
So basically, tax exemptions for the housing of clergy of all religions. That would be a case where the power to tax, the power to destroy is what the arguments are going to come. It's also one of the rare issues where liberal religious groups are going to be just as upset as the conservatives. You've created a kind of bedfellows situation there. You also would immediately have to look to see what kinds of housing allowances and other forms of benefits are extended to non-religious nonprofits, because you would you'd be trying not to treat them differently. That's an out-of-the-blue question, but that, I think, let's put it this way, the Democrats have bigger fish to fry this year on tax exemptions than that question. Maybe that's one of their fallback positions.
And the Equality Act, which we could talk about in quite a bit. But read up on the Equality Act, which has denied reliance on religious arguments in gay discrimination cases. Every Democrat running for president has supported that, and every Democrat running for the House of Representatives this year favors that act. It's one thing, I think, to say there's a real contest here. There's a religious view, there's the gay rights approach, and, they're kind of going at each other. But if you eliminate this and take it out of the discussion, that's a whole other thing.
Just to put that in Mississippi terms, picture religious schools in Mississippi losing the ability to have gender-specific bathrooms, showers, and other facilities in a religious institution, because the religious defense would no longer be viable.
Right.
Yes, Pastor.
I think I've got these stats right. It's a Pew Research, this recent article in the Christian Century about the rise of the non-affiliated.
Right.
And that figure in the last decade has skyrocketed.
Right.
I believe that number was around 24% even.
That's where it's headed.
Right. But check me on this. I think they said in that article that there were more, that was the largest group now, even more than the Catholics or the Evangelicals.
Yep.
That the rise of the nuns is the largest segment of our non-religious population, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. They're the big three. You know.
Right.
Yeah, Catholic, Evangelical, non-religious, or nuns, meaning N-O-N-E-S, not affiliated.
And among Democrats, they really skew to be in the Democratic Party. That's the point I was trying to make earlier. Now, there are people who, for the first time in the most recent major U.S. Social Service survey, saw the first sign that Gen Y, coming after the millennials, Gen Y appears to have leveled off on the surge to religiously unaffiliated and may even have declined slightly. The first sign that that rocket may level off.
And if you go
We
to
need more work there.
GetReligion.org
Yes.
advertisement, you'll see Mr. Mattingly's approach to this last Thursday, Friday. And then if you tune in Thursday morning, you'll see I go after Terry.
Yeah, he's going to give his take on some of those initial findings this coming Thursday.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yes, sir.
It has been written that Attorney General Barr has strong Catholic roots and leanings. Do you see his efforts to influence policy?
He's Protestant, I believe, right?
No, Barr is Catholic.
Barr is? Okay. Oh, I'm thinking, never, yeah.
And has been known to be occasionally seen in the same photograph with members of Opus Dei.
That's, of course, yeah. I was thinking of...
Coming soon to a Brown novel near you.
Yeah.
Or whatever they call those things. I don't know if I call them novels, but he's the same man who worked for Herbert Walker Bush. I think you would have to attribute a lot of the controversy about him to the president that he may or may not be totally willingly serving right now. I mean, there seems to be evidence kind of cutting both ways, but I think you would also have to say that the press coverage of his statements and his views has rather markedly changed since Bush 1 era as well. To say that we live in a slightly more hostile press environment would be the understatement of the year.
Well, wasn't it at Notre Dame where he gave that very important speech?
Yes.
Yeah, look that up online if you're interested in this area with Barr. Yeah.
What's the essence of that speech?
Well, he was, beating the drum for what you might call the old-time religion, that this is important, and putting it into a conservative socio-political context.
He was saying that the outright secular attacks on religious freedom and religious traditional organizations, he sees that rising. And of course, we've already talked about that in terms of some of these conversations. And in a very important remark during the U.S. Supreme Court testimony for the Colorado Bake Shop case, who was it, Solicitor General? Someone representing the Obama administration was asked point blank, do you see the tax status of Christian colleges and universities being in question?
Oh, that was in the Obergefell, the gay marriage case.
It was in Obergefell,
Yeah.
sorry.
But you're right, yeah.
And he basically said that will be a part of the discussion. And for those of you who follow the court closely, what we're all dealing with, and Justice Kennedy punted on this in the cake shop case and admitted that he punted. He all but said, someday we're going to have to decide that, and it's not going to be me. Punt. It basically came down to at what point will the John Brown case on the government being willing to intervene on doctrinal debates about race in a Christian college format, at what point will John Brown be applied to LGBTQ issues? Because the court has not equated sexual orientation with race yet. They've come really close, but that's a big, big issue to watch. This year in the court, we've got several cases where that conceivably could come up in a decision at the court this year.
Another way to go at a religious college is regional accreditation.
Yes.
Which is a life and death matter for most colleges. And we had a very interesting case several years ago in Massachusetts, Gordon College, an evangelical school, was not quite threatened, but I would say questioned, because it holds to an old-fashioned view on sexual morality, which is required of students and faculty. They negotiated their way out of that, but I think that's going to be a growing issue in this coming decade.
Last week, the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, which is a more conservative expression of Lutheranism, they closed Concordia College in Portland because of a head-on collision with accreditation and internships. All of the local public schools were refusing to recognize their education degrees anymore. That has nothing to do with the government. It has nothing to do with the U.S. Supreme Court. That's a whole other front in these battles.
And
so
nothing
they
to do with
ended up
tax
closing the
exemption.
school.
Yeah, all right. Big issues coming.
I wanted to ask you, Terry, if by some waving of magic wand, you were named editor at the same time of both the New York Times and the Washington Post, what would you do to improve coverage of religion?
Well, let's say I'm going to run the Times because they just posted a job description for a new national level religion beat reporter, and they have pledged this reporter she or he will live somewhere out in the middle of the country, which is a big deal if you're at the New York Times. We're watching this like a hawk. It could be a major event in religion coverage in America if a highly qualified, experienced religion beat reporter gets that job. And I could name some names today, but that probably wouldn't be constructive. But the long and the short of it, if the press has a problem with quality religion coverage, you address that problem the way you would anything else in journalism. You hire yourself an experienced, trained, maybe even award-winning specialty reporter on that beat. You pay them as much of a salary as you can pay them in the current marketplace, and you tell them to go cover stories. Mm-hmm. That's how you would improve your coverage of soccer or science or education or Supreme Court. You hire somebody who has demonstrated the ability to do it, and you let them go. Basically, it's a journalistic solution to a journalistic problem. It's the way you would address any other beat. But for some reason, in the 40 years I've been watching this, and Dick, about the same time or even longer, this isn't what many editors do. They move somebody out of a suburban bureau or something, or they kind of lowball the equation. And that makes me mad because I think religion is an incredibly important force in American public life and discourse. Half of the First Amendment is pretty high standing, in my opinion, with the press. I would like to see them go first class on this and really get themselves a star.
And the other
Hire
half,
someone away from the Atlantic Monthly, just to hint at a name.
yeah, Atlantic, terrific work in the Atlantic Monthly. Just to pick up on the other half, if I were Marty Barron running the Washington Post, I'd say, keep doing what you're doing. The Washington Post, day to day, week to week, is beating the New York Times to a bloody pulp on religion coverage.
Terry, you had an interesting observation to me earlier about what you would do with a religion reporter at the Washington Post in this election.
Yeah, and I will mention a name there because she's a former colleague at GetReligion. That may embarrass her some these days, but Sarah Pulliam Bailey is one of the rising stars in religion writing in America under anyone's watch. We both agree on that?
Yep.
If I was already beating the New York Times and I was looking at the incredibly interesting role that religion is going to play in the Democratic Party race, and you were looking at will the evangelicals deliver for Trump again, etc., I would take Sarah Pulliam Bailey and for the next 18 months, move her to the political desk. And I wouldn't have anything come out on religion and politics that she was not a co-byline right there because of her sources, her information, her knowledge of vocabulary of the world of religion, her understanding of who these groups are and their complexity. And like you said, they would beat up on the Times even more.
By the way, we're in a charitable situation in the news business, just if you haven't thought about this. Why is the Washington Post doing such a great job? they got Bezos billions behind them. They have all kinds of opportunities to do stuff. Or Terry mentioned the Atlantic Monthly. They got $500,000 from the Henry Luce Foundation, from the Time Magazine family, to cover religion, and it's paid off with Emma Green in particular. It's terrific.
Good. So you'd recommend people reading the Atlantic to?
Yeah,
We'll do a commercial for that.
Yeah.
You bet.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Emma Green, and now we're using a name, Emma continues to break hard news stories. Excuse me. Hard news stories and hardcore, newsy, information-driven reporting in what would normally be an interpretive magazine format. We've seen this bizarre thing now where hard news subjects break in the Atlantic, and you end up with the Associated Press and newspapers chasing the Atlantic Monthly, which is, supposed to be an interpretive magazine. But in the internet age, if Emma writes something and it's got tremendous sourcing and very relevant factual information, bang, that goes up. And the next thing you know, everybody's chasing her.
And by the way, Emma came out of Georgetown, wasn't that much older than most of the folks out here when she started with the Atlantic. So that should be an inspiring note.
Yep.
The next president is likely to have at least one Supreme Court nomination.
Yeah, probably two.
Will religion play any role in that?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you think?
Yeah.
I'm just the questioner.
Well, that's the number one factor in the conservative Protestant vote in this country. There's no question.
I don't. That's just such a funny question, if I could say so. It's been the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has been at the heart of our battles for 25, 30 years.
Yeah, it's sort of our national legislature in a sense. I mean, two words: Donald Trump.
The entire logic of the lesser of two evils case for Trump all pivots on the Supreme Court and nothing else. That is why 40% of evangelicals said, I felt I had to vote for Trump even though I didn't want to. Supreme Court.
And by the way, don't miss the importance of the next level down, the Circuit Federal Appeals Courts.
Yes.
And the huge numbers of Republican nominees that have gone in the last 3 or 4 years, with McConnell running the Senate. I forget the numbers, but the number of federal cases that actually get to the Supreme Court compared to the next layer down is, 20 to 1 easily. Yeah.
Other question? Yes.
When I first came to America in 1978, every time I mentioned that America is a Christian country, my professors used to correct me and said, no. Are we seeing now that America is becoming a Christian country?
Yes and no. America has always been Christian in terms of individual citizens' religious choices, but we do have good old separation of church and state. So you can't really say it's a Christian country in that sense. And it's probably less Christianized right now than it's been for some time.
Certainly higher percentages of openly secular atheist and agnostic people. I've always argued just a phrase that I kind of came up with and we all debated back when I was doing the church-state separation degree at Baylor University, when I did a master's degree back there years ago. I would argue that America is not a Christian nation, it's a Protestant nation, and that so many of our structures are based on individualism and individual choice. So now, back to George Gallup and others, if we've got 22 to 23% of actively practicing religious believers of various things, Orthodox Jews, etc., and we have the atheist, agnostic, religiously unaffiliated, who's in the middle? And the phrase I've always used for them is Oprah America. It's basically people who are vaguely religious. They go to church some, and how you win them just totally depends on how you frame issues and how you kind of express things in a more emotional sense. And this is why Trump's hit you in the jaw approach apparently moved a lot of people in that middle. But that's also the swing vote of the semi-active Catholics and the whatever.
Democrats aren't into framing, you know, at least now.
But I don't think you can say America is a doctrinally Christian nation. Some people might consider that. I would say maybe we're culturally semi-Christian moving into post-Christian in terms of how the nation actually lives its life on a daily basis.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
In the back.
We actually have a question for Charles Overby. How do you balance your commitment to maintaining the First Amendment while also sitting on one of the largest private prison corporations in the U.S., which successfully lobbied against the Freedom of Information Act request in private prisons?
Well,
Which?
there's a question for me.
Oh, okay.
Well, I'm proud of my affiliation with CoreCivic. It works hard to provide safe prisons, alternatives that often state governments and federal governments cannot provide. We don't have to go any further than the state of Mississippi to see what a crisis we have in prisons. And CoreCivic, along with one other private prison company, helps provide an alternative and a safety net for what is really one of the most serious problems we have in our country today. Thank you for that question. Yes, sir.
I think you're spot on with the normal Catholics, as you put it. I think they are the huge. Being a Catholic originally from Pennsylvania, I think he's spot on. But with Bloomberg and his recent rise, none of you address what happens if Bloomberg continues. You know, Bernie's only got 31% vote.
Yeah.
All the others drop out. I guarantee you, you're not going to go all Bernie. You're probably going to go to Bloomberg. And so what happens if Bloomberg does get the nomination? What do you think will happen to those normal Catholics? Do you think they'll switch from the Republican? Because Bloomberg is very moderate.
Yeah, will Catholics go for Bloomberg? I honestly don't know. This is a very unpredictable bunch of candidates and a very unpredictable bunch of voters this year. I think there could be a lot of surprises. Oh, we've had surprises already. I would not expect Sanders would do that well with, let's say, independents, okay, who are kind of looking, which party am I going to go with, if they are religiously active. I don't see an appeal there for Sanders or Bloomberg.
If you look at Bloomberg's record, he tends to be kind of economically and institutionally conservative, but liberal on moral and social issues. And he has, from my perspective as a First Amendment liberal, he has a bad record on First Amendment issues, especially religious liberty in New York, which means in many ways he's the opposite of the Catholic Church, which tends to be progressive on economic issues, immigration issues, labor union, and then conservative on moral and social issues. So it would depend a lot on how the press covered him and whether they really investigated what he did as mayor and made a lot of that public.
You don't think he'll attract some of those Republicans who did not want to vote for Trump? Voted out of...
But remember, their primary issue is Supreme Court, First Amendment, religious liberty is really, in many ways, their court issue. That's what the Supreme Court stands for them. So to some degree, his weakest issues, peeling them off, are those issues. Just where he's weakest.
Put a fine point on this, New York City is possibly alone among municipalities in the United States where the public schools will not rent to churches like on Sunday. They will rent to all kinds of community groups and this, that, and the other. The one exception is they will not rent to a church. Now, who does this hit? This hits relatively poverty-stricken immigrant groups.
Yep.
For whom churches or houses of worship, synagogues, are all important in terms of building community and becoming stable and rooted in the United States.
And when it comes to finding a place they can afford to worship in New York City, this took away their primary option. And once again, we're back to that equal access law. I think that's going to end up being tested eventually because they're not offering equal access to different types of nonprofit groups. They have said these nonprofit groups are more dangerous to church-state separation than any others based on religion, whereas these others, alcohol groups, labor unions, artistic groups, all kinds of other people, those NGOs, those nonprofit groups get to use these facilities.
Yeah.
I remember one detail from one story that I thought was fascinating. His administration was particularly upset that an Assemblies of God Latino church, I believe it was meeting in a public school, and the pictures of the students were on the wall. And at one point during the service, they asked the parishioners to pray for the students who they're not there physically, they're pictures. And the administration thought that was a huge violation of separation of church and state, that they were praying for the students just looking at their pictures, which is a pretty wild First Amendment speech situation. Stop and think about it. Plus, if you don't believe in God, you don't believe in prayer, what do you care what they do? I mean,
Religion aside, turnout. If Bloomberg gets the nomination, he'll pump those countless billions into turnout, and that will decide the election. For instance, if Hillary Clinton had gotten the same turnout as Barack Obama in two cities, Detroit, Milwaukee,
alone, yeah,
she would be president of the United States.
Question here in the middle. Can we get a microphone to you?
Hi. My first question is, President Trump was the first president to attend the March for Life, and I'm curious what y'all think is the impact that might have on voters, especially since you called him one of the most secular presidents in history, if this is more of a publicity stunt or what your interpretation of that is.
I think he has the pro-life and evangelical vote and a lot of the, Sunday go to meeting, mass attending Catholics pretty well wrapped up. So that was a base move. That was consolidating the base. He thinks the base is going to give him the White House. I don't buy that. I think it's much more complicated. I mean, I would give him a very different game plan if it were up to me.
Writing at GetReligion, I made the point that I thought it was fascinating that several major newspapers said that he went to that event to solidify his evangelical vote. Well, if you've ever attended or covered the National Right to Life, it's predominantly Catholic.
Yeah.
If you draw a circle around Washington, D.C., and figure how far can you drive a school bus or a rented bus to get to that event, you're looking heavily at Catholic areas, and you're looking at Pennsylvania, you're looking at the edge of the Midwest. If I'm sure the people who told him to make that symbolic move were just as concerned or more concerned about Catholic voters, Sunday morning Catholic voters, than they were evangelicals. I agree with Dick that he pretty much already has the lesser of two evil evangelical vote locked up. So I think he was working on Catholics with that move.
My second question has to do with that Catholic vote as well. What influence of Pope Francis's more liberal influences, his teachings about issues on immigration or on the environment, do you think that could have some pull against the Republican leaning of Catholics?
I don't think so, just based on looking at the 2016 election. Although you could look at 2018 and make a case for that. But I'm pretty skeptical. I don't know, Terry might disagree.
No, I totally agree. I don't think it will have much of an impact at all, in large part because that's where a lot of Catholic voters, quite frankly, are not agreeing with the Pope on those issues. You could make a case that second and third generation Latinos are not agreeing with him on those issues in America, in many parts including Florida and Texas, which are pretty important states. So I would, it's also crucial to separate what Pope Francis is quoted as saying in news coverage versus what he actually said. My all-time favorite example of that is we still hear this him saying we need to get off of cultural issues, maybe pay less attention to abortion. And he did say that. But nobody covers the speech he gave the next day at Italy's leading Right to Life conference, which was blistering on Western imperialism causing abortion, and not supporting women and families. And he called it cultural imperialism, I believe is a phrase he used in that speech. So it kind of helps to listen to Francis more than once.
Right.
The man is a Jesuit, for God's sake.
Right.
By the way, Wednesday night debate in Nevada, Saturday night vote in Nevada will be very interesting in terms of Latino Catholics.
Interesting. Thank you, guys.
Yes, sir. Can you move the mic over there? Yeah, there you go.
Hi, I was just wondering, what do you guys make of the recent decision for the United Methodist Church to split? And do you think that will have any effect in years to come?
I don't think it's going to have a political effect. It's a massive story because the United Methodist Church is the single most American church, if you're looking spread coast to coast from one end to the other.
They're in every county in the country, I believe.
Yeah, has a United Methodist Church in it. And the war over what the Bible says about a host of issues, it's not just gay rights. That's how the press has covered it. There's a bunch of other issues involved in this related to the Bible and whatever else. That battle is now going to come to everybody's zip code. Because if they pass the legislation they're expected to pass this summer, local churches will decide which way they go on a 50-50 vote.
You probably saw the Daily covered this in the Monday edition. One interesting aspect of the Methodist situation compared with other groups that have moved to the left on the gay clergy and gay marriage type questions is that they have a substantial overseas voting population. So what's going to happen is the conservatives in the United States will be a minority of what comes out of the Methodists in the United States, I would predict. But they will be an international fellowship,
Right.
because they got 5-6 million folks in the Philippines and Africa.
The question I keep hearing from more people than any other is if the conservatives were winning the vote, and they were, why did they surrender? Why did they in effect volunteer to leave? And that's because they don't want the seminaries, which are going bankrupt. They don't want the bureaucracy. They don't want the think tanks. They're saying, take them, you pay for them. We're going to leave, start over with a global fellowship with very heavy populations in Asia and Africa.
And all their ministers come out of Asbury up in mid-Kentucky, which doesn't get any money from the denomination.
Yeah.
That's where their pastors come from.
Something like 75% of the growing United Methodist churches in America are led by pastors from Asbury, which isn't even a United Methodist seminary.
This has been a very illuminating conversation. We're out of time, but Dick and Terry will stay behind and answer any questions you have. If you want to continue to hear this kind of informed commentary, I encourage you to go on a regular basis to GetReligion.org, which is now part of the Overby Center.
You sign up for a daily little short summary of what we do, and we also do podcasts.
Let's thank Dick and Terry for a great conversation.